a fire breaks out in the engine of a British Airways Boeing 747 carrying more than 350 passengers shortly after takeoff from Los Angeles. The pilots, astonishingly, decide not to head back to the airport. Rather, they choose to press on with their trip to London, a choice that would subsequently cause more issues. This is the contentious tale of Flight 268 from British Airways. A British Airways Boeing 747 carrying 352 passengers and 18 crew members took off from Los Angeles International Airport in the United States on the evening of February 20th, 2005. Their travel time to get to London's Heathrow Airport was estimated to be 11 hours. With 3 pilots on board, the journey was quite lengthy. Behind the 2 pilots are a captain seated in the left seat, a first officer seated in the right seat, and a second first officer seated in one of the jump seats. During the cruise, this extra first officer would take over from each pilot, giving them all time to rest. The Boeing 747-400 they were flying was 16 years old. Even though it was first unveiled in 1989, the aircraft was still quite contemporary in 2005. The previous 747 iteration's hundreds of mechanical dials had been replaced in the cockpit with CRT screens, which provided the same information in a more relevant and easily accessed manner and eliminated the need for a flight engineer. The cockpit looked like something from Star Trek, especially at night. As was usual, things weren't looking too well in the UK on this gloomy, wet night at LAX. In the event that there were delays in reaching London, the pilots made the decision to carry an additional 4 tons of fuel. Their journey's total fuel weight increased to 119 metric tons as a result. Flight 268 pushed back from the gate at Los Angeles after all of the passengers had boarded and the luggage was loaded. It was a little after 9, maybe 10 minutes. The airplane is taxied out to LAX's runway 24L by the first officer. For this flight return to the UK, he would be the pilot and the captain, the pilot, in charge of pilot monitoring. Everything was proceeding as planned thus far. The travelers relaxed in the cabin for the lengthy nocturnal flight. Before leaving for London the following day, the most of them would be attempting to get some rest. Not even the crew or passengers could have predicted what would happen in the few seconds after the plane took off. The first officer positioned himself on the runway just after 29, and he pushed the jumbo's enormous engines to initiate takeoff thrust. After the 747 sped down the runway, the first officer lifted it into the skies a little more than a minute later. Then it took place. The plane shook just after the captain adjusted the gear handle, causing a loud, continuous thumping sound. The aircraft swung to the left, as felt by the first officer. To fix this, he pressed the right rudder. Flames were visible to the passengers, coming from beneath the left wing of the airplane. The pilots found an instant solution to the issue. Engine number 2, the engine backfiring, was the source of the loud booms that were audible. On their instruments, the pilots could see that the temperature of the exhaust gas was approaching unsafe levels. They have to move quickly. The captain returned engine 2's throttle to the idling setting. The controller at LAX Tower reported to the pilots that he saw flames coming out of the engine at that same moment. The pumping sound stopped when the skipper pulled back on the throttle. The 2 other pilots had only ever encountered an engine surge in his simulator. The captain had previously experienced one while in flight. Although terrifying, This was not an emergency in the traditional sense. With just 3 of its 4 engines, the 747 can fly extremely successfully. However, the pilots would have to declare an emergency if there was a fire in the engine or if the source of the surge started to harm other engines. Air traffic control was notified by the captain of a pan-pan. This is the next step down from stating an emergency. It conveys the urgent need for assistance and the seriousness of the pilot's position. It stops short of saying that the residents' lives are in immediate danger, though. To keep near the airport, the controller instructed the pilots to turn. In order to give them some room to work out their problems, he also instructed them to ascend to 5,000 feet. The 11-hour flight did not start well. The plane stabilized at 5,000 feet after a few minutes, and the pilot started preparing for what to do next. Restoring the engine's proper operation would be the ideal situation. Behind him, in the jump seat, was the first officer, to whom the captain handed the quick reference guide. As the primary first officer piloted the aircraft, he started to read out the tasks for the captain to do. To make sure the engine had a steady supply of ignition, the captain first set engine 2 to continuous ignition. He then eased the throttle forward. The pilots hoped that they might ease the engine back to full power over time. But the engine was ready to run as soon as the captain depressed the throttle. Throttle forward, and the pounding sound came back. It appeared that they would not be able to get the engine to start again. However, there remained a possibility that the engine was simply not receiving enough air. After all, an out-of-proportion combination of fuel, air, and ignition is what causes a surge. The first officer decided to up the aircraft's speed just in case, thinking that the extra air entering the engine would provide it with some fuel. The captain eased the throttle for engine number 2 once more, but the sputtering returned exactly as it had the last time. It was all the pilots could do. There was a major problem with the engine. There would be no way for them to restart it. The skipper reluctantly deactivated the engine's fuel supply and shifted the throttle to idle. The second engine shut off. It was now flight 268 with 3 engines. Now that the technical aspect of the troubleshooting was resolved, the pilots were faced with a new decision tree to navigate. And for this, they would primarily rely on their own experience rather than checklists. The next line of action would have been obvious at this point if they had been flying a 2-engine aircraft, such as the Boeing 777 that British Airways also operates on its long-haul operations. They would just dump gasoline and head back to Los Angeles with just 1 engine operating. However, losing an engine on a 4-engine aircraft doesn't have the same impact as it would on a 2-engine aircraft. Strangely enough, that made things harder for the pilots, because there was a chance they could reach Heathrow with 3 engines still operational. They had to make a choice now. Should they return to LAX and land there, or should they carry on to Heathrow? The pilots needed to gather some information before they could figure this out. In order to advise the chief flight attendant, also referred to as the cabin service director, and to inspect some passenger windows for damage, the captain dispatched the first officer in the jump seat back into the passenger cabin. In the meantime, the captain and first officer started analyzing their choices up in the cockpit. Finding out if the aircraft would even make it to Heathrow with 3 engines was the first task. This is because the plane cannot fly at its typical cruising altitude, where the air is thin and the engines consume less fuel, because the 3 engines are not powerful enough. Rather, they would need to travel at a lower altitude, where fuel consumption is higher due to thicker air. Their flight management computer was informed that they would arrive at Heathrow with 7 tons of fuel remaining after it was programmed to detect an engine loss. This exceeded the 4.5 tons that were required by law. Based on the fundamental fuel perspective, the pilots could go to Heathrow without any issues. However, the pilots would need, what if their engine failed again while they were traveling? What if, in the middle of the ocean, the malfunctioning engine started to cause issues? The first officer reached a passenger window on the left side of the airplane as the pilot considered this. He was disappointed to find that there wasn't much to see in the dark. A pilot passenger informed him that he believed there had been an engine surge, while other passengers reported seeing flames originating from that engine. In the end, the information the passengers reported proved to be far more valuable than what the first officer could see through the window. After opening the cockpit, the pilots carried on with their discussions. They could see that Engine 2 was windmilling regularly by looking at the engine instruments, which suggested that there hadn't been any major structural damage to it. Since they had cut off the fuel supply, there was no sign of a fire or anything else. They also reasoned that if there was still a problem with the flight, it would most likely show up rather quickly. It was fortunate for them that their path to the United Kingdom would pass through the continental United States, which was nearly overflowing with airports for diversions. In the event of an emergency during the following few hours, they might just as easily land at LAX, Minneapolis, Chicago, Boston, or any number of other airports. Furthermore, they couldn't even return to Los Angeles if they wanted to because of how hefty they were. They would need to dump a ton of fuel, roughly 70 tons, in order to return to LAX. 40 minutes just for that. And the truth of the matter was that the pilot knew full well that carrying out this maneuver would cause financial and logistical difficulties for the airline when it came to booking 3 52 passengers. Over $300,000 would be spent by the airlines if they were to dump 70 tons of fuel into the Pacific Ocean and then land back at LAX. Returning passengers safely may be the airline's top priority, but $300,000 is also highly desirable. The captain requested additional information from British Airways base at Heathrow via radio. They stated that, in the end, the captain had the final say, and that they would have preferred if the fight had gone on. As long as the aircraft was in a safe condition, which the captain would determine, the pilots were required by company policy to continue to their destination. Making this choice was not simple. After returning from the cabin, the first officer notified the pilots of the situation. It became evident from his description of what he had seen that Engine 2 had most likely surged, but there had been no additional damage. The pilots utilized their manuals to ascertain that, in the improbable scenario that an additional engine failed during their journey, such as while they were leaving the Atlantic, the aircraft would remain airworthy, and they could make a detour to a different airfield. The captain made contact with air traffic control, letting them know that the plane would be proceeding on to Heathrow and that the pan scenario would be canceled. Ascending into the darkness, Flight 268 made its way northeast. The aircraft was traveling at flight level 270, or roughly 27,000 feet, 2 hours into the voyage. At 75% of the speed, or Mach 0.75, it was traveling at. Though this was far slower and lower than it would normally fly, it was not problematic. Nothing further had gone wrong since the fight had climbed out of Los Angeles, and the aircraft was flying smoothly. The flight management computer predicted that the aircraft would arrive at Heathrow with 10 tons of fuel left, which is far more than was required. Most of the travelers were dozing off. This odd noise during takeoff is now only a faint memory as the plane nearly arrived at Heathrow on time. The crew officer, who had been occupying the jump seat, was replaced in the captain's left-hand seat as a temporary resident. The plan was for the captain to return to the flight deck upon reaching the U.S. East Coast, evaluate the situation, and determine whether to continue over the Atlantic Ocean or to divert to one of the close U.S. airports. They would not have taken the aircraft across the Atlantic if there was any indication of problems. The flight crew had handled this crisis admirably up to this moment. They had kept the airline and the cabin staff informed, had effectively communicated, and had devised a realistic plan of action based on their knowledge of the circumstances. However, things would start to go awry over the Atlantic. This time, the training of the pilots would be the issue rather than the aircraft. The captain reappeared on the flight deck to assess the situation before to the aircraft's arrival to the U.S. East Coast. Everything appeared to be in order for the flight to continue over, given the fuel on board, the state of the engines, and the expected fuel at Heathrow. The Atlantic Ocean is that. The ocean is that. The pilots determined that flight level 320, or roughly 32,000 feet, was the most efficient altitude to fly at for the voyage. Since the airplane had burnt off most of its fuel weight over the U.S., it would be able to climb to this altitude. However, when the pilots asked air traffic control for this, they were informed that since other planes were passing over from Europe at this altitude, they could not be allowed flight level 320. They could only be cleared to either flight level 350 or 290 by controllers. Given their present weight, flight level 350 was not feasible on 3 engines. Thus, the crew had to settle for flight level 290. Their flight manager computer indicated that they would arrive at Heathrow with approximately 7 tons of fuel left, despite the fact that it was a little low. This was somewhat more than the 6.5 tons of landing fuel that the pilots had determined was necessary. It appeared that they might have to squeeze through a little tighter, but if the jet operated as planned, they should arrive at Heathrow. As the 747 glided far above the Atlantic into the dawn on February 21st, 2005, everything seemed to be in order. The pilots kept an eye on the fuel levels in each of the aircraft's tanks and ensured that the excess fuel from Tank 2, which was connected to the malfunctioning engine, was evenly transferred to the other tanks by the use of jettison override pumps. For the duration of this trip, the method went okay, but the crew would soon run into issues with it. After several hours, as aircraft 268 approached the Irish coast, it was down to 12 tons of fuel. By now, the crew had ascended to flight level 350, which allowed them to conserve fuel. But now, they had a headwind, and it was more intense than expected. At this point, their flight manager computer was estimating that they would arrive at Heathrow with 6.5 tons of fuel. They had determined that this amount of fuel would be the minimum and the point at which they would have to detour. The crew reluctantly agreed that they would have to make a detour to Manchester. They let their traffic know, managed and configured this new path within their machine. The FMC provided 7 tons of landing fuel at Manchester. This was only 500 klu more than what they would have gained if the aircraft had arrived at its intended destination, Heathrow. However, there are safety margins in place for a reason, and pushing them has historically resulted in several mishaps. The group then started their diversion. An issue surfaced as the plane descended. The fuel supply to the other tanks has been cut off from tank number 2. The pilot's fuel level was already lower than they desired. Not being able to get at their remaining fuel in tank number 2 was the last thing they needed. Their predicament had suddenly gotten worse. On this flight, the captain reported a pan to air traffic control for the second time. Landing had to be prioritized for him. He was authorized by the controller to travel up to 10 miles from a May 5th left at Manchester. Thank goodness they were already descending for the crew. Since planes usually descend at idle power or close to it, fuel consumption is negligible. However, a caution alerting the pilot to the plane's low fuel level then showed up on the central display. There was only 900 kilograms of fuel left in tank number 4. The pilot was unaware that the fuel imbalance issue was the result of a problem with British Airways manuals. These told the crew to transfer fuel from tank number 2 to the other tanks using the jettison pumps, which they had been doing. Contrary to what was stated in the Boeing manuals, this involved taking the drastic step of turning off both of the outboard tank's main pumps in order to allow fuel to flow from an inboard main tank, such as tank number 2, to an outboard main tank, such as tank 4. The reason the pilots refrained from doing this was their concern that it would empty one of the tanks. They could have given it more thought if they hadn't been preoccupied with the aircraft during the descent and detour into Manchester. The pilots activated the crossfeed valves and turned on all of the major fuel tanks in response to the low fuel quantity signal. This made it possible for fuel to move freely between the tanks and guaranteed that fuel would reach all 3 of the operational engines. The captain was now starting to worry that he might not be able to reach the airport with the required minimum of 4.5 tons of fuel because they were still heading down towards Manchester. He hadn't expected to have issues with the fuel balance, and receiving the low gasoline quantity notice was definitely not what he had expected. Compared to the 10 tons of gasoline he was expected to have upon arriving at Heathrow, this was a far cry. He alerted air traffic control to a full emergency, just in case. He relieved the first officer of control and took over flying the aircraft in accordance with British Airways emergency protocols. All the passengers in the back of the aircraft knew was that they were making a diversion to Manchester. An anxious few minutes passed in the cockpit as the pilots continued to assess their fuel situation and set up the aircraft for landing. While the second first officer in the jump seat helped the pilots with the extra burden resulting from the emergency diversion, the first officer was in charge of the radios. Arriving in Manchester at 5 minutes after 4 local time, Flight 268 made a successful landing. The 18 crew members and 352 passengers have all arrived safely. It turns out that the pilots ultimately landed with 5.8 tons of fuel left, which is a little bit more than was necessary. However, the tale is not over yet. British Airways was ultimately hit with a lawsuit by the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration, which claimed that the airline was flying an unworthy aircraft. According to BA, the pilots of Flight 268 flew the aircraft safely and in line with corporate protocol, but because of the negative attention this episode generated, BA decided to add another operational factor, the potential passenger and public perception of doing so, to the list of considerations the crew and airline must weigh when deciding whether to proceed or divert. If you're wondering how a crew would handle a similar situation today, Tim Steeds, the former head of safety and security at British Airways, explained that after discussing it with the operations department, and choosing an appropriate airport in North America near their flight plan route, a crew would choose to divert in the same circumstances. Steed said, "The crew would never have emptied the gasoline tank and gone back to Los Angeles, and the corporation would have left the decision with the captain to proceed to the destination." The UK's Air Accidents Investigation Branch, or AAIB, looked into this occurrence and found no evidence that continuing the flight would have significantly increased the risk. It did, however, reveal shortcomings in the pilot's fuel management instruction. The lack of confidence among the 3 pilots regarding the availability of gasoline, coupled with their inability to manage fuel while 3 engines were running, suggested that their knowledge of the fuel system was inadequate. Following this event, British Airways went back to the fuel handling protocol that Boeing's experts had suggested. Together with their regular simulator training, they included more engine-out fuel management training. Regarding the initial cause of Engine 2's surge, the specific Rolls-Royce engine variety installed in this aircraft was susceptible to a particular kind of wear in which the internal fans of the engine wore away at their casing, disrupting the engine's internal airflow. Engine surges may result from this, particularly if the engines are operating at high thrust levels like they would during takeoff. Engines today are even more dependable than they were in 2005, and pilots receive more thorough training these days on handling fuel in similar circumstances. But the days of passenger planes with 4 engines are drawing to an end. It appears likely that fewer and fewer pilots will have to decide whether to continue a flight after an engine shutdown, because all of the new long-haul jets have 2 engines.